We're over halfway through a series at Matt called Patterns. And what we've been doing with this is looking at the book of Proverbs and spending time in this book of wisdom, showing God's pattern for our lives. So if you have a Bible or access to a Bible on your phone, I would invite you to turn to Proverbs chapter 14 this morning. We're going to look at a verse from that chapter as well as some other scriptures along the way. But as you're turning there, I want to do a quick overview of the goal of this series in case you're new or you're newer with us. The purpose of this series, first of all, it begins with seeing a contrast between the pattern of the world, the attitudes and the behaviors of our culture, and God's pattern for our lives. Now, I know based on the way maybe I'm even holding my hands, it could appear that these are equally valid and good patterns and you just choose one. It's important, though, to recognize that the pattern of the world is, in fact, a distortion of our humanity, of who we were made to be. It is rooted in self rather than rooted in God, and behind the pattern of this world, what drives it forward is an enemy. An enemy who is seeking to steal, kill, and destroy, the way the Bible defines the job description of this enemy, and to distort God's design for us as human beings, to confuse us about why we're here, why we're made. And that is why it is so easy to see people trapped in addictive behaviors, quickly entangled in conflict where it's like we're just ready to fight at any moment. So much trouble in this world because we have an enemy that is driving this pattern, but it is also why we're taking time to look at God's pattern for our lives so we can know who we were made to be. Because here's the stakes. The reality is if we don't understand our design, we are not going to be able to function. Let me share an example to illustrate that. A friend loaned me their car several months back, and it was the nicest car I've ever been in. And they loaned it to me like it was just some beater that they had. I don't know why they loaned me their car, but I'm sitting in their car. I have the keys. I have somewhere to be, but there's no keyhole in the car. And so I'm looking everywhere, and I'm opening little compartments, and where do I put the key here? And I was really frustrated, and after a couple minutes, I was just hoping and praying nobody was videoing me. And it wasn't going to be a YouTube thing later, right? And go viral. Look at this idiot in the front seat of this new car. And finally, I open up the glove compartment, pull out the manual, and go to ignition. And by this point, I just really feel dumb. But I'm looking, and then it's it's just a button you push. And if you have the key with you, the car knows it, and it'll start. Otherwise, the button won't work. I'm like, whoa, how cool, right? But also how frustrating if you don't understand how the car is designed to work. The point is, what we're looking for in this book of Proverbs and what we're seeing, I want to point out, are not religious rules that God is imposing on you. You need to live this way. He's just simply giving us the manual for how we're designed to function as human beings. And I think lots of times as humans, we can be like me, sitting in that driver's seat, and we've got the car. Maybe, I don't know if you want to think of that as your life, and you're there, and you're ready, but you have no clue how to go about it. And you don't know how to make progress, and it's frustrating, and you're trying stuff, and it's not working. This is why God is so good to us, to give us His pattern for our lives. So we want to know His design, but I want us to be really clear here. Sometimes church culture can get stuck in this pattern of just learning. I just am here to learn some more. Our goal isn't simply to learn God's pattern for our lives. For example, when I opened up that glove compartment and I got out that manual and started reading, do you think it's because I wanted to learn a lot about cars? I was just curious. Do you think it's because I wanted to pick up a little quote from one of the pages to impress people later with my knowledge of the vehicle? Why did I open the manual? Go ahead. Start the car so that I could go. I wanted to make progress. I wanted something to work. I wanted to hear the engine fire up so that I could move forward. Isn't that what we want in our lives? That is why we're going through this. At Mac, we talk about this, our mission statement. We are all about the life-changing grace and truth of Jesus. Yes, we want to know the truth of Jesus. Awesome. Yes, we want to experience His grace, His unmerited kindness and love toward us. But the whole reason we want to experience those is we want change. I want to look back and say, I'm not the same person I used to be. Do you feel that way? You know, it reminds me of the title verse for this series that we've been through, which again, you've probably heard, and you could actually read this with me. We'll put it up on the screen. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Say this with me. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That, in a snapshot, is God's heart. That's His design, His desire for you and for me, summarized with one word, transformed. We've looked at that Greek word. Originally, it was the Bible, the New Testament was written in the Greek. That word is metamorphosis. It's literally the word that the writer of this verse uses. God's heart for you is metamorphosis. And the simplest way I can put this is God is not interested in well-behaved caterpillars. God is not interested in well-informed caterpillars. God wants butterflies. You get it? He wants to bring about radical transformation in our lives, and as beautiful as that sounds, and we go, yay, what that means is we go through some stretching, and we find out parts of ourselves that we didn't even know we had, and we feel squashed and constricted at times, and we're in territory that we didn't even know we could be in, but the end result is beautiful. That is God's desire. That's our heart for the series. That's His heart for you and for me. And so this morning, with that sort of introduction to the foundation of this time together, we're going to move now into the next sort of topic of the series and talk about contentment. That's the topic for today, and you had to know this was going to come at the end of this last week, right? One of the craziest weeks in recent history. Contentment, and we did not plan this. I didn't say, oh, well, this is after the election, so let's do contentment, but I think God planned it. We're going to talk today about God's design of you and of me for us to be at peace versus our natural tendency toward, you fill in the blank, envy and anxiety and resentment and greed and everything that eats away at us and in the end ultimately disturbs the way we were designed to live. So I had you turn to Proverbs 14, and now I'm going to have you look at a verse in that chapter if you're there. Proverbs 14, verse 30. And then we're going to, again, follow up with some other scriptures later. But Proverbs 14, verse 30 says this. A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. Read that one more time. A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. Now, right away, you can see this really stark contrast, right? We're talking about the pattern of the world versus God's pattern for our lives. God's pattern for you, friend, is to have a heart that is tranquil versus bones that are rotting. And this again points to God's design for you. Because imagine, let's go back to the car analogy. Imagine you see a car driving down the road and it's sputtering and stalling and there's smoke coming out from under the hood. If you were to see such a car driving down the road, how would you assess the health of that car? Not good, right? You would look at that car and you would know just right away there's something not functioning right there. That car is in some way, or maybe multiple ways, not operating as it was designed to operate. And so when you see this description of rotten bones, this is God saying, I didn't design you for this. You're not working the way I made you to work. What He says is, I designed you to be tranquil. Now, I don't know what you think of when you hear that word. I think of somebody who's like off on the top of a mountain and they're unaware of anything going on in the world. That's not what that word means. That's not the idea that you're in your own little world. It means you know that you have everything you need. You have this deep, settled sense that everything that you have is everything that you need. And if you're going to get anything else, it's because God allows that to come into your life. Everything's taken care of, so you're not losing sleep over what you don't have, versus whether it's a possession, whether it's an image that you're striving for. You know you have what you need. The result is tranquility. The alternative, as God lays it out, here's the alternative, is rottenness. Rotten bones. Now, you may hear that and think, okay, this has got to be some exaggeration for the sake of effect, right? Let me ask you, though, if you've ever experienced anxiety or resentment or jealousy in a way that you physically felt it. Anybody willing to raise their hand and say yes? Absolutely. And usually it's quite a ways down the road for when that rottenness begins. And you tune in a moment and go, I feel horrible. My legs literally hurt. So I think he's being very literal here. And what that is, again, is God's way of saying you're not made to function this way. Something is off. You're not experiencing tranquility. You're experiencing rottenness in your bones. So this is God's pattern versus the world's pattern. I think it's safe to say we probably all prefer God's pattern, right? I think so. Tranquility as opposed to rotten bones. The question is, though, how come most of us find ourselves so wrapped up in anxiety and in envy and in wanting what we don't have and in resentment and all of these things that eat away at us? I think there's two answers. The first answer that comes to my mind is what's going on inside of us. The other is what is outside of us that we're allowing in. I want to talk briefly about those two things today. The first thing is what is going on inside of us. You maybe have heard these verses from the previous weeks, but James chapter 4, James writes in the first verse of this chapter, and he asks a question. He says this, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Now his focus in this question is out there, among, right? What causes problems in humanity? What causes conflict and tension and fighting and all of this? And then he answers the question, is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? He shifts the focus. You want to know where all of this comes from? Right here. He goes on, you desire and do not have. Here's how it typically works out. So you murder. Now you may say, okay, good, that's not me. Yeah, good. Thank you, nobody, you've never murdered. But let's back it up, right? You desire and do not have, so you gossip. You desire and do not have, so you ice somebody out of your life. You desire and do not have, so you throw them a look so that they know that you're not happy with them. You fill in the blank. But he goes on and says, you covet, and you cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. And what James is doing here is he's identifying the root of discontentment. And it is this, I want something, I can't get it, so I'm going to do what I have to get it. That's where fighting, that's where manipulation and greed and corruption come from. And by the way, this is why the Proverbs tell us in chapter 4 of the Proverbs, he says, guard your what? Flocks. No, guard your heart. Above all things, guard your heart, because everything you see out there originated with here. Guard that place. Be aware of what's going on there. So the first step that I want to say toward contentment is learning to be aware of what's going on in here. You ever notice sometimes we're just, you got the smoke coming or the black smoke coming out your tailpipe and you just press on the gas pedal even harder? Maybe not with your car, but with our lives. Yeah, whatever. Fine, I'll medicate or I'll distract myself. And we don't really often take time to sit down and say, what's going on in here? Now, the second part that I mentioned in terms of the root and the cause of discontentment, not only what's going on in here, but what's going on out there that I'm allowing in here. Because we put things in us, and what we put in affects what's going on. Anybody ever, can you relate to that? Yeah. You watch a news channel, you hear a thing, you see something in your feed, somebody says something to you. All of these inputs, the windows into our soul, we allow all kinds of things in, and they all affect and change us. And sometimes I would say we deceive ourselves into thinking that I can watch this, or I can hear this, or I can feast on this, and it won't change anything here. It'll just go in and out. It's not true. What we put in affects what's going on. Think again of your car. If you decided this week that instead of gasoline, you were going to do vinegar in your tank, how would it function? Or Diet Coke? It's not going to work, right? Because the car wasn't designed to function that way. And so God's like, I made you to have certain things coming in that's going to feed and foster contentment. What ends up happening, though, is we end up the other way around and we're feeding discontentment. So in addition to asking, what is going on in here, which I think we could ask that every day, multiple times a day, and it'd be really good. What's going on in here? A more simple question to ask is, what's going in here? Make sense? What's going on in here, and what's going in here that's feeding what's going on in here? I'll admit neither of these questions are easy. They're very easy to stand up here and talk about. And they're very easy to write down, not so easy to practice. Because we are needy people, we're vulnerable, we're all over the place. And on top of it, we're inundated with the pattern of the world, which is filled with messages designed to make us discontent. Anybody feel that? It's basically an American value to envy what other people have, where you envy someone's success. If I just had that life. If I just had their intelligence, if I just had those gifts or that body. We subscribe to resources and we consume content that feeds the virus of discontentment in our souls. And it's so consistent and regular for most of us that we don't even realize it's there. We just learn to live with it. Imagine driving down the road in your car and there's a clack, 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 clack. And then at first you hear it, but then after a week or two, it's just how cars were made to sound. Right? You have a puddle of oil on your thing and then, year after year, it's just a bigger puddle of oil. And what we forget is, no. God didn't make me to run this way. There's something wrong going on in me if this is the fruit. And so the first step is look at what's going on in here. Look at what's going in here. Now, I have some good news, I have some bad news. The bad news first is you can't do this alone. The work that I just shared with you, look at what's going on in your heart. You can't do that alone. You can't diagnose the condition of your own heart and fix what's going on. The good news is you don't have to. God never tells us to fix ourselves. Amen? Religion tells us to fix ourselves. And we end up trying until we die. God says, you can't fix yourself. That's why I sent my son Jesus to die for your sins, to bring you back to me so I could do the work. So that's the good news. And what we see going on here, God promises that I am the one who's going to make the caterpillar into the butterfly. Literally, in nature, he's the one who makes the caterpillar into a butterfly, and in our lives, he's the one who brings about metamorphosis. So when there's a warning light, here's an example. When there's a warning light on the dashboard of the car, whether it's check engine or oil or whatever, that light is there to signal you to something deeper going on, right? So you see that little light, which is a neat little light, you're like, oh, cool. But it's to tell you there's something deeper going on that you're not seeing right now, okay? Now, I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to know that cars used to be fairly simple, where you have a light, and that light means a thing, yeah? Add oil. Okay, cool, I can add oil. And now you have these lights come on that are tied into these really complex computer systems that have all kinds of different codes. And so one light could come on, but that could mean lots of different things. And there's no way I'm going to know what's wrong unless I go to the mechanic who plugs it into the code reader. I don't know if that's what it's called. And then it pulls up this code, D1059A- something. And the mechanic goes, well, it means this. You need this part, right? I'm sharing this because the symptoms that we experience in our lives and whatever flavor of rottenness you're feeling at the time, it could be envy, it could be resentment, whatever it is that's like, okay, there's the smoke under the hood, there's the light on my dashboard. We are not equipped in ourselves to diagnose, much less fix anything there. And I can prove it to you because in the Bible, in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, this man of God, this prophet Jeremiah expresses absolute helplessness as it relates to what's going on right here. He says this, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? You think about the most corrupt, deceitful thing out there you can imagine. Jeremiah says, nothing is more deceitful than this. And then he goes, who can understand it? That's like another way of saying, yeah, I've got problems. I hear the backfire noise. I see the light on the thing, but I don't have a clue how to read the code. Make sense? And so my only option is just keep driving down the road and go, oh, well. But we often stop after this verse. The very next verse, God happily interjects. He says this, I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind. Translation? I have a code reader. Yeah? Come to me. Don't try to fix the problem. Don't despair that there's such rottenness going on there. Just sit down with me and plug in, and I'll tell you what's wrong. Oh, and by the way, I can fix it. So as tempting as it may be for us to go off by ourselves and either feel bad and shameful or say, I'm going to knock this out, I'm going to stop. You're not. We're not. We're helpless. But the application is to get with him and allow him to diagnose and to interpret as the living word the thoughts and intentions of our hearts. And by the way, we could probably stop there, end the message, because that is the application for every single message we could say is get with God and let him work. And it doesn't matter what the topic is. We could be talking about anything. You could be at peace at the end of a message. You could be angsty. You could be angry. You could disagree. The application is get with God. Let him speak. Let him work. But I want to drill in a little bit more. We have a little bit more time, so I want to talk a little bit more about discontentment in our lives because the Bible offers what it calls a secret to contentment. A secret. When we feel envious or jealous or whatever, God gives us a path toward contentment. Now, it doesn't mean, hey, here's the secret to never feel discontent again. That's not realistic. We're human, we're fallen, we live in the world, we're always going to deal with these feelings. The question is, what do we do when we feel those come up? How do we navigate? God tells us, thankfully. So I'm going to have you turn to Philippians chapter 4. This is in the New Testament, kind of near the end. And we're going to read 3 verses here where Paul shares with us the secret to contentment. As you're turning there, I just want to admit, anytime somebody promises me the secret to anything, what do you think? You're like, okay, what are you selling? Right? Here's the secret to rock hard abs in 14 days. I can tell you it doesn't work, okay? Or there's a secret to success, the secret, right? But Paul in this chapter, inspired by God himself, shares with us what he's learned through lots of severe ups and downs and how he has learned to be content through all of it. So verse 11 of Philippians 4, here is what Paul writes. He says, I have learned in whatever situation how to be content. It's a bold statement. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And here's the secret. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Now that is one of the most quotable, recognizable verses in the Bible. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. I do want to point out, however, though, that based on the context of what he just got done saying, he's not speaking primarily about being able to lift 1,000 pounds. He's not talking about being able to do windsurfing on your first try or whatever, okay? Even though God can help us with all of those things. What he's talking about is the circumstances of life that we face. In all of the different circumstances, all things, all situations, I know how to be content. So this morning even, just speaking to you directly, if you're online with us, whether you are really low and nothing seems to be going right for you, and you're down and you're hopeless and you're frustrated and you're angry, fill in the blank, or everything is just dialed in right now in your life. Things are going well, it's gone the way you hoped it would and better. What Paul is saying here is something very revolutionary. He's saying neither of those scenarios should ultimately affect your contentment. Whether you have nothing or whether you have everything, it doesn't matter. Now, I know that probably sounds revolutionary, the idea that contentment is not based on what you have or don't have. And the reason I think it sounds shocking, at least to me it does, is because it is the opposite of the world's pattern. There's probably no greater contrast in this message than at this point, where the world would say contentment is based entirely on what you have. If you just had this car or phone or this much money, you'd be happy, right? Who's familiar with that message? If you just had this job, you'd be happy. If you just had a body that was in that kind of shape, you'd feel good about yourself. If you just had that president, you'd be happy. Now, obviously, you knew I was going to bring that up, didn't you? The elephant in the room or the donkey, I don't know which. Anyway, I was planning on saying something because it's absolutely central in our culture and in our week about the election and all of that, and I just didn't know which name to plug in, right? All week long, I just had blanks in my notes. And I'm not even going to say any names because you know what struck me as I was thinking and praying about this? I was like, it doesn't matter what name I end up putting in here because the message doesn't change. Now, our country might change, but this doesn't change. And you know why? Verse 11, look at it again if you're still open. Philippians 4:11, I have learned how to be content no matter the situation. Is that true? No matter the situation. And I want to acknowledge just right away that it is okay, it is right to be affected by what's going on in our country. Some of you are super excited, some of you feel devastated. And it's right to care because this stuff affects our lives. It affects the practical stuff of our lives. But at the end of the day, whatever the outcome, can we agree with Paul? Whatever the situation, I've learned how to be content. Can we agree with him? See, the reason I think this is so hard for us, it's hard for me, is because I'm constantly bombarded, whether it's social media or TV commercials or computer or whatever, we're constantly bombarded with the message that we don't have enough. We're constantly bombarded with messages that are designed to make us feel just a little bit unhappy. And I'll explain what I mean, whether it is your phone or your body or your job or your money. The goal is to introduce just enough discontentment so that you don't know it's being introduced, but enough discontentment to the point where when a solution is presented, you buy it or you believe it. The problem is it's a cycle because you are never satisfied, and so we just continue in this cycle of discontentment. Here's how to be happy. Oh, great, I'll do it. And then we're on to the next thing. I was talking with somebody this week about a scam that they experienced where this person called them on the phone, got them to give them access to their computer. You can do the remote thing. Installed a virus. And then when the person saw all these things popping up, the person says, I have software to fix that virus. That, oh, by the way, they just installed. How crazy is that? I started wondering as I was thinking and listening to this person, who or what has been given access to your soul? Who or what has access to your soul? Where we've said, okay, here we go, I'm turning it over to you. On a daily basis even. What kind of, if you're a computer person, what kind of scripts, what kind of programs are running in the background? And it may sound something, the script may sound like this, you're not enough, you don't have enough, you don't look like enough, there's something wrong fundamentally with you. And if you had this, it wouldn't be wrong anymore. And you find yourself thinking, even without being aware of it, yeah, I know I have a phone, but I don't have that phone. I know I have a car, I like my car, but I don't have that one. Or I'm thankful that I have a house, but I don't have that cabin on the lake that I see so many pictures of. And by the way, I think that one of the greatest things that feed this virus of discontentment is comparison to one another. Where we look at other people and we think, that should be me. How come that's not me? We see that picture-perfect family and we go, man, that's how come I don't have a family like that? Or my kids don't sit still for a picture like that. Even though it's probably just a snapshot of a moment before the fighting erupted, right? How come I don't have that personality? How come I don't have those abilities? Paul speaks directly to our natural tendency toward comparison. He just flat out says, when people measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are not wise. It's just blunt. And I'll just personalize it. I am not wise when I do this, which I do this because all it does is fuel discontent. And what ultimately happens is it keeps us from enjoying who God made us to be. It keeps you from being present to the reality of who God made you to be, not who He didn't make you to be. Or what God has given you versus what He hasn't given you. And we can never really actually enjoy anything. The secret, though, that Paul says and God Himself offers us, He says, I can do all things, who? Through Christ, who gives me strength. You know, the root of discontentment is I'm lacking. I'm lacking. I don't have enough. I'm not full. I'm incomplete. And so he says, I can do all things through Christ who fills me up in those places where I normally tend toward rottenness. See that? Those places that just rottenness loves to live, Christ fills me in those places. And what happens when we don't feel full often is we go looking to be filled up in people and in things and in circumstances and ambitions that were not designed by God to fill us in that way. And so we're just fueling the discontent. But Paul says, no, through Him, though, I have strength for all those places that normally tend toward discontentment. He fills me. It's not through the world. It's not through my stuff. It's not through the, election outcome. It's through Christ who gives me all I need to be content. And there's two things that I want to talk about before we end this morning that I think Paul means when he says through Christ. Because what does that mean? Christ is not here with me. I mean, He's here by His Spirit. But what does that mean? Through Christ, I can be totally content in any and every circumstance. Two things. The first is through His presence. The second is through His provision. We're going to talk about those two. The first one, through His presence. Is there anybody in your life, let me ask you, that you love to be around? Hopefully, multiple people that you can say. I see some spouses looking at each other. That's nice, yeah. It really is for me, it's my wife. Like, when she's in the room, it doesn't matter what, she doesn't have to say anything or do anything. I just, my blood pressure goes down. I feel happier. I'm like, yes. Whenever she leaves town, I just burn time at night. I stay up way too late watching some ridiculous show or something because I just can't go to sleep without her. Now, eventually I go to sleep, but it just doesn't feel right. When she's in the room, I feel better. Now, what I want to say is God designed us for this with Him. He designed us to live in His presence, and the essence of sin all the way back in the garden is to walk away from the presence of God and the oversight of God and the provision of God and to say, I can do it on my own, God, which introduces all kinds of angst and discontentment because we're not designed to live life apart from God. And so God's presence is this theme throughout the entire Bible. Psalm 23, you probably recognize these words. David says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Let me ask you, what is the worst case scenario life can throw at you? That's it. Death. It's all over. It's done. He goes, even there, in the most extremely horrible situation, he continues, I will fear no evil. Why? For you give me lots of stuff? No, for you're with me. I know. I don't have to fear, which means that's tranquility. I'm at peace because you're with me and I trust you and I know you're here. His presence. Psalm 16, another quick example. David says, in your presence is fullness of joy. Notice again the contrast between lacking, I don't have what I need, God, and being full. Like, what's the best meal you've ever eaten? And you get done, and I don't know, Thanksgiving is what comes to my mind. And you're at the end of the day, and if somebody walked up and said, hey, you want a cheeseburger? And you'd be like, no, I'm full, I'm good. I'm content. In your presence is fullness. I'm full. I would say the number one cause of discontentment in humanity is separation from God. It's not finding joy in God as we were made to function. And when we stop finding joy in God, we go looking for joy in all these places that can't give us the fullness for which we were made. That's it. And all this, by the way, started all the way back in the garden with Adam and Eve, who had everything they could have ever needed or wanted. And I know maybe you've thought before, if it were me, I would not have messed it up. I had all that food and the beauty, and I had dominion. I got to name the animals, and God was with me, and what more could you want? Well, at some point, they stopped believing God could satisfy them. They stopped believing that God really was enough. They started wondering, I bet there's more out there, and the rest is history. Literally, the scenario that's been playing on a loop through history over and over and over since that first human sin, which I would say is the sin of discontentment. It's not enough, God. I want more. God, though, pulls us back in his mercy with this secret. He says, hey, listen, through me, through Christ, you're going to have everything you need. And we've already talked about through his presence. The second thing I said we'd mention is through his provision. That is the second aspect of contentment in God's recipe, is designed for who we're made. And I think this is so critically important, because to realize that I'm human and I have lots of practical needs. God made me and designed me in a lot of ways for my contentment to rest on a lot of these needs. I need food, I need water, I need clothing, I need relationships. We're not going to function unless we have some of these needs met. And if you don't believe me, Paul himself admits this. Writing to Timothy, he says to Timothy, if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. I smile every time I read this, because Paul, the same guy who just said, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, which sometimes they just see as this idealistic platitude that none of us can achieve. I could go sit in a corner with Jesus for the rest of my life and be happy. Here he says, yeah, but it'd also be nice to have some food and some clothes. And what he's pointing to is through Christ doesn't just mean I'm sitting alone with Jesus. It means everything that comes through Christ. God is the one who's providing for me. He's the one who's present with me. And that is the recipe for my contentment, is him. He is the one providing all of these things. And what he's illuminating here is we're complex people. We're body, and we're mind, and we're soul, and we're spirit, and there are tons of needs on that spectrum. And so when somebody comes up to us, especially in the church, we can be guilty of this one-track thinking, where somebody comes up and has this issue they're going through, and we're like, you just need to read your Bible more. Everybody ever experienced that or said that? And to be clear, maybe they do need to read their Bible more. But they might also just need a friend. They might also just need somebody to listen to them and show up. Or there's times when I feel cranky and I hear this voice that says, you are a fundamentally evil person, Or I could just need to go eat some food. That'd probably help. Or get better sleep at night. And I'm not kidding. We're humans, and sometimes I think we overlook all of these different needs that God has designed us to have met. Now, here's the key. He promises to meet our needs. And at times when we feel like, well, I don't think my needs being promised for, or provided here, what then, Micah? That's when we have his presence and the past record of his faithfulness, and we trust that even when it doesn't feel the right timing for us, he knows what we need and when we need it. And sometimes even for us to be hungry, literally or metaphorically, is good. It's what we need. And so we trust him. And this is what Jesus urges us to do. Matthew chapter 6, he says, don't be anxious about your life, right? Don't be anxious about, what you're going to eat or drink or your body or the clothes you're going to wear. And by the way, he's not saying don't get a job and go buy food and eat. He's saying don't be anxious. Don't be consumed with those things. Don't make them your God. And he points to the birds. Look at the birds. They're not flying around all fretful. They're not sowing. They're not reaping. They're just taking what's given to them by the Father. And he says this, are you not of much more value than the birds? See, Paul's secret was that he knew not only is God with me through Christ, but God is providing for me. Everything that I am and everything that I have is a product of his provision. But even here, I feel this danger of discontentment because I'm like, okay, God, thank you. I've been provided for so much in my life. I can point to so much. Why am I still discontent? Here's what I think happens is we stop trusting God, even in moments that he's going to continue providing. He gives us a paycheck, and I think, God, how about the next 20? That'd be great. Or here's your daily bread. I'm like, I'd like my weekly bread. Thank you. And so I think sometimes without realizing it, we stop trusting that God is going to continue providing. And when we stop trusting, we start clinging to things. We start stockpiling. Instead of saying, I have enough money this month and I know I'll have enough next month, we start putting away as much as we can and we forget to be generous and all this stuff happens because we stop believing that God cares about us. And he knows what we need and when we need it. And what happens over time, and here's the drift that I've felt in my own life, and I'll share it with you, is we go from enjoying things from God to seeing things as God. We shift from enjoying things from God. All this is from him. I'm so thankful to seeing things as God. The focus is the key. God and things. Where am I looking? My contentment is no longer through you, Jesus. It's this stuff. It's my job. It's my ability to hold my life together, to provide for myself, to make sure that this works out, right? One of the most sobering pictures of this drift is in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy 8, God's people. And you don't need to turn there. I'm going to do a fast summary because God's people are heading toward the promised land, which God has promised to them, and it represents so much of their hopes and dreams. And God tells them, I'm going to give you this land, but I'm also going to warn you what's likely to happen when you get into this land. And so he says in verse 7, I'm going to bring you into this land. It is a good land. There's rivers and there's springs and there's valleys and there's food everywhere. It's going to be this amazing place. And in verse 9, he says, you will lack nothing. How would you like to hear that? You're going to have everything. You're going to come in. There's going to be vineyards that you didn't plant, but you're going to enjoy their fruit. I'm going to just give it to you. But listen, when you get into this land, verse 12, when you have eaten and are full and have good homes, and your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold multiplies, beware, lest you say in your heart, I did this. Verse 14, he says, beware, lest your heart become proud, and you forget the Lord your God. Beware lest you forget who gave you this. And by the end of this chapter, their focus shifts from their provider to what's been provided, to the stuff, the wealth, and the tragedy of this shift, friends. And this is where I think it gets intensely practical. What the Bible teaches is that when our focus is on squeezing satisfaction out of things or out of people, we will never be satisfied. That's what the Bible says. I'm going to share a verse with you in a minute to illustrate that, but it's like trying to run your car without gasoline. Go, go, go. It's not going to go. Because you're not made for that. Solomon, the one who wrote the Proverbs, also wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And listen to what he says in Ecclesiastes 5, verse 10. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money. That's profound. And he who loves wealth with his income. You ever set a benchmark for wealth and say, if I just made 40,000 or whatever, just plugging something in, and realize you get to 40,000 and the benchmark moves? Or maybe it's a health goal and you say, you know what, if I just that, then I could be happy. And by the way, I'm not promoting complacency, sitting there and saying, well, it doesn't matter. There's a difference between being complacent, which is laziness and inactivity, and being content. With contentment, I'm happy, but I'm also actively pursuing and I'm living life. But what he's saying here, first of all, the problem isn't wealth. The problem isn't money. He says, he who loves money, he who has inordinate desire for the stuff as if that's the thing that's going to fill them up will never actually be full. You'll never actually be satisfied if your focus is those things apart from God. And so when we feel perpetually discontent, there's never enough. I don't have enough this. I'm not beautiful enough. I don't have enough. Those feelings are not God punishing us. It's simply revealing the fact we're not functioning the way we were made to function. It's just spiritual biology. It's God's way of saying, warning light, warning light. There's something off. You're putting your hope in the wrong things. You're chasing after the wrong things. And what he's pointing to in these verses is the secret to contentment is God's presence and his provision. Hebrews 13:5, I think it's Hebrews 13:5. I can't read that. Yeah, Hebrews 13:5 says this, keep your life free from the love of money. Notice he doesn't say money. There's nothing wrong with money. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. That's the key. Remember, God is with you. He's going to give you all you need. And by the way, he's the best treasure you could ever have or want. And when you know that, his presence, his provision, his promise to stay with you no matter what, that's where true contentment comes from. And here's what I want to say, ironically. At this moment, that is the only time you can truly enjoy the things that God gives you. Because you're not grasping to them and clinging to them and squeezing every little ounce of life out. And then when you lose them, your world falls apart. That's not enjoyment. Or if your world revolves around a hobby and you're like, this is everything, that's not enjoyment, it's idolatry. But when God is where he should be, we can enjoy him because we have open hands. God, thank you for this gift today. And if it goes away, it's disappointing, it's a bummer, but we realize, hey, God, all of this came from you. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's when you can really enjoy stuff, which I think is a beautiful irony. I got to wrap it up. I want to offer, as we close here, a practical remedy for discontentment. Because I know we all have it. It's not like, hey, you discontent people. We're all discontent. We all have this feeling of rottenness. It comes and goes. It changes shape. But again, I just want to illustrate, remind us the first step is his presence. His presence, meaning if you're here today and you don't have Jesus in your heart, in your life, that's step one. Putting your trust in him, saying, I believe you made me. I believe you designed me. And my design and my function and my purpose in this world revolves around you. And so I want to just ask you, tell you, challenge you, encourage you, take that step today between you and him. Say, Jesus, I want to know you. See, the good news of the Bible is that God sent his son Jesus into the world to die on the cross. Why? Not because Jesus did anything wrong, but to pay for my sin and your sin. For us rejecting his design for us and saying, I know better, God. For us walking away from his presence. God sent his son into the world to bring us back to him. And the beautiful aspect, the beautiful truth is that the only step required for you to take is to believe. It's to believe. It's to hear the news and say, I believe, Jesus, that you are who you say you are. And I want to be back with my Creator. That's it. And so step one, if you've not done that, do that today, because none of the rest of it will matter if you don't have that relationship. This isn't about church attendance. It's not about religion. It's not about giving money. Not about trying to be a good person. It's about surrendering your life to Jesus. So that is step one, is the presence of God, and where you experience his provision and go, God, you do have me. And you'll know it for the first time. But the second thing, which is just more practical, it's a prescription for discontentment. Because you could say, okay, Micah, I've given my life to Jesus. I still struggle with discontentment. What now? God gives us a prescription for discontentment in the Bible. There's a little handy holiday coming up. You may have heard of it. Thanksgiving. Yeah, okay. Where God, I believe Thanksgiving is God's prescription for discontentment. And so if you picture God, he's this doctor. I know I'm changing metaphors. We had the mechanic, God's the mechanic, and now he's the doctor, okay? But picture God writing out on a doctor's prescription note. He's writing this and he's handing it to you. You ready for it? Okay. 1 Thessalonians 5:18, he writes this, give thanks in all circumstances. For this is the will of God for you in Christ Jesus. What's God's will for me? Where should I go to school? Who should I marry? Well, I believe he's going to lead us into those truths, into those things, but here's his will. No matter what happens, give thanks. Think of it like this for a second. You go to the doctor, you're in pain, and you tell the doctor, I'm really hurting here. And the doctor says, okay, go home tonight, and I want you to do this, this, and this, all right? And then come back tomorrow. Imagine that you went home that night, though, and you did none of those things. And then you woke up the next morning and you had the same pain. And you go back to the doctor and you say, "Doctor, I still have this pain." What do you think the doctor's going to say? Probably depends on how nice your doctor is, but probably something to the effect of, "Did you do what I said?" And if you say, "Nope," he'll say, "Why not?" Right? And eventually just say, "Go do what I said and then come back and tell me how you feel." Right? God's prescription, God knows we have a problem. He knows we have rottenness in our bones. It's not a surprise to him. And he writes out his prescription: give thanks in all circumstances. Now, you may think, okay, great, Micah, how do I actually do that though? For starters, recognize that it's called thanksgiving instead of thanks feeling. I'm giving thanks. It is a choice to give thanks. Imagine you went to the doctor, you said, "Doctor, I'm going to take your prescription as soon as I feel better." The doctor's like, "You've got it mixed up, man." Right? Take the prescription and you'll start to feel better. And I think as Christians, as people, it's like, as soon as I feel it, yeah, then I'll roll with it, right? We have to be able to take ourselves in hand a little and say, "This is the prescription. I don't know that I feel like it, but I'm going to do it." Give thanks, thanksgiving, and trusting that as we take this prescription God has given us, that the temperature of our souls will change and the feeling will come. What this means is cultivating the habit of looking for the good. Think of one area, allow one area, person, situation where you've really only been noticing the bad. I want to challenge you today and this week to look for the good. Maybe, you live in a 2-bedroom house and you're like, 2 bedrooms, I don't have enough room, I got no room for an office or whatever. Maybe say, "Man, I'm so thankful I have a house in the snow." Or you say, the person I voted for didn't get elected as president. It's all coming apart, right? Or think, "Man, how many people in this world would die for the chance to have a vote, a voice in who's in office?" I don't know what that is, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but whatever that is, it's a habit. It's saying, "Okay, you know what?" And just to be clear, this doesn't mean we're fake. Everything's okay, Jesus is on the throne. Like, yes, he is, but there's also a lot of mess. There's a lot of pain. And I think we need to be able to say, this is really, really hard. But I am thankful God is with me. And or whatever that is, you fill in the blank. You don't let the sentence end there. And you take the prescription and you trust him and believe he's going to change you. Worship team, if you would come forward, we'll close. 2 quick questions to close, and this is something I would encourage you to just maybe sit with in our time of worship response, or just take with you and be in God's presence. Just allow him to work and do what he does. Don't feel like you have to fix yourself. But here's 2 questions. Number 1, what is fueling your discontent right now? What are you thinking about? What are you watching? What are you reading that's feeding discontentment and rottenness in your soul, in your bones? And just a practical suggestion, it might feel a little too simple, but just identify one source this week and either turn it off or limit your exposure. And I want to suggest this too, and I don't mean any offense, and I'm not reading into anything, but it might be a person. Now, if it's your spouse, come talk to me. Let's work through that. But there may be somebody that you're around and they always turn it in a direction that fuels discontentment. And maybe there's an opportunity for you to just respond with a simple, "Yes, but I'm thankful for." And maybe you could have an influence in turning the temperature of those conversations. Just become aware. Again, what's going on in here? What's fueling and what's going in here? The second question that I want to end us with is, what is your experience of God's presence? This is a hard one because in the one sense, you can look at the Bible and say, God is everywhere, right? Good, that settles it. Not really. Because that doesn't mean that everyone everywhere has the experience of fullness of joy, as David puts it. So what's the difference? How do I separate the reality of his presence with the experience of his presence? And here's what I would say. There's several of you in the room today. Some of you I have had interactions with, others with you I don't know. I don't have any interactions. I haven't been affected or changed in any way by your presence. You're here, but I have not walked over and engaged with you. So it's recognizing, yeah, God's here generically. It's true. It's theology. But what is one step this week where you walk across the room and engage? And maybe it's a sitting in a chair for 10 minutes and just being still before God. And every time interruptions come through your mind, which they will, I promise, have a little simple verse or a mantra. For example, Psalm 46:10 is a great one. Be still and know that I am God. Just that. And then the next time you have thoughts of the election, it's just be still and know that you are God. Turn it to Him. Whatever that is, the step is moving into a place where you're experiencing His presence, not just believing in it. Pray with me, would you? God, we thank you for your meticulous care for our souls. That you know, as the expert of our humanity, everything that is going on in every heart and mind this morning. And you're not appalled, you're not shocked or surprised. You see it all as if it's laid out before you on a table. But God, in that moment, you're also filled with love and forgiveness and optimism and a hope at the transformation that you want to do in each one of our hearts and our minds and our lives. And Jesus, we're just throwing ourselves upon you, recognizing we don't have the ability to fix ourselves. We don't have the ability to change ourselves, Jesus, but you do. And you promise it to us. We thank you for your presence, God. We ask that you would illuminate and continue to illuminate areas where we're allowing viruses into our souls. And shut those doors and say, no more. I'm tired of living in a way I wasn't designed to live. We ask all this, Jesus, in your name and ultimately for your glory. Amen.